amen. Another reason why I needed them to sing another, I just put a peppermint in my mouth. Amen. Come with me to the collection of writings called the Old Testament, the book of Nehemiah. We're in chapter 2 this morning. Nehemiah chapter 2. So the first few verses, take our contextual message from verses 1 through 10. But let's just read a few of these verses of chapter 2. And it came to pass in the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of Artaxerxes king, that wine was before him. And I took up the wine and gave it unto the king. Now I had not been before time sad in his presence. Wherefore the king said unto me, Why is thy countenance sad, seeing thou art not sick? This is nothing else but sorrow of heart. Then I was very sore afraid, and said unto the king, Let the king live forever. Why should not my countenance be sad, when the city, the place of my father's sepulchres, lieth waste, and the gates thereof are consumed with fire? Then the king said unto me, For what doest thou make request? So I prayed to the God of heaven. Amen. You may be seated. I want to talk to you this morning as we continue the series from the book of Nehemiah. I want to talk to you from this subject, preparation for a tough job. Preparation for a tough job. Thank you, ushers and nurses. There are a few areas in life that we live or work in that do not come ready equipped with a superior or a boss or another authority figure. Students, teachers, nurses, executives, salesmen, airline pilots, coaches, chefs, or scientists all have immediate superiors whose presence significantly controls and affects their lives. In our task, or it's our task then to develop qualities of leadership that are germinating within us while still being accountable to those superiors or individuals who are over us and control or have a certain amount of influence on us. And that's not easy, because leaders are usually better at leading than being led. Leaders are usually better at leading than being led. The question remains, when that time of confrontation comes between you and a superior, between a boss and an employee, a parent and a child, coach and a player, teacher and a student, how do you handle when that moment of confrontation comes? And then that question becomes a little more complex, or increasingly complex, when the superior, the person that is over you, is insensitive to or unconcerned about spiritual things. Hudson Taylor once said, "It is possible to move men through God by prayer alone. It is possible." And as a leader, you and I will come to places where those in authority authority over you are beyond your power to change. The message God has for you at that point is to pray. Nehemiah had worked under a man who just happened to be the king of Syria. There's a saying that goes, don't try to change it. It's like the law of the Medes and the Persians. And that means that something is impossible to change. And so here Nehemiah is working under the king of Persia, Artaxerxes, who is the king of both the Medes and the Persians. And he had a reputation for being impossible to change. Anybody ever had any impossible people to deal with? Well, the king had a reputation of being impossible, hard to deal with. And so Nehemiah was in an influential position. He played an intimate part in the king's life. But Nehemiah's heart wasn't in Persia. It was in Jerusalem. But since his heart was not in Persia, his body was in Persia. His heart was in Jerusalem. His body was in Persia. And Artaxerxes was the king of Persia. Now, just to make sure y'all are with me this morning, there's an old contemporary song that says, your body is here with me, but your mind is on the other side of town. Stop messing with me around. Right? And so, y'all know that. I'm just checking to see if y'all with me. I know this is boring, but so here's the situation that Nehemiah is in. His body is in Persia. His job is being the cupbearer for the king, which means he's to test all of the food and drink that come before the king to make sure that there's no one trying to poison the king. If they're going to poison the king, they're going to kill the cupbearer first. Because he's got to sample everything that is to go to the king. And so imagine the king looking at Nehemiah and saying, hey man, your body is here with me, but your mind is on the other side of town. Nehemiah's heart was in Jerusalem, but his body was in Persia. And so here he is standing before the king. And the king looks at him and said, wait a minute now. I noticed something different about you. You're not looking happy-go-lucky. There's no sense of joy on your face.
All right.
Is there something you want to tell me about? Is somebody trying to do? Have you tasted something that was supposed to come to me? So there's a problem with the king because he's looking at Nehemiah and Nehemiah's face just ain't looking right.
All right.
Nehemiah, in chapter 1, we talk about how Nehemiah had sought the Lord in prayer because he knew that was the only way that he was going to be able to do something about his situation. And not only the only way he was going to do something about his situation, but that was the only way that he was going to change the king's heart. When you look at verse 4, it said, after the king had talked to him about his countenance, Nehemiah says he immediately prayed to the God of heaven. And I believe his prayer is in verse 11, or some is wrapped in between verses 1 and 11, and where he probably said these words to God: God, I beseech you, hear me, because your ear is always attentive to the prayers of your servants. And I delight in your name. God, I need you to do something for me. Now, as he's praying this prayer, I imagine Nehemiah was asking God to help him to be successful, Brother Roosevelt. He probably said, God, I need you to answer this prayer so that the desires of my heart might be fulfilled, that I might be successful today. Not only successful, but that you might help me to find compassion before this man, the king, that I've got to appear before. So really what Nehemiah was saying, Lord, you need to change the heart of the king. Because if you change the heart of the king, if you alter the king's attitude, if you do that, then my situation will change and I'll be allowed to do, God, your will with the king's pleasure. So Nehemiah says, God, I need you to move on the person that's over me so that you can change his heart and his attitude so that I can fulfill your will with the pleasure of the king. Y'all heard that?
All right.
He didn't ration and harshly and rush off and run to Jerusalem because Jerusalem was in trouble. But he stopped and said, Lord, I need to get permission. I need you to touch the heart of the king so that the king can let me go. But verse 4 says he prayed. But let's look at the beginning of chapter 2, because we left chapter 1 with Nehemiah praying. And then we get to chapter 2, verse number 4, and Nehemiah's praying again. Something is happening while Nehemiah is praying. And if you're going to be a good leader, if you're going to be a godly leader, you've got to understand, number one, that waiting is essential. Waiting is essential. Nehemiah prayed to the Lord, and chapter 1 and chapter 2 will share with us that when he prayed, nothing happened. At least not right away. When you look at chapter 1, verse 1, look at it with me. You see that the story of Nehemiah opens in the month of Chislev, Chislev. And it resumes in chapter 2, verse 1. Now is the month of Nisan, Nisan. Chislev is December. Nisan is April. So for 4 months, Nehemiah prayed and nothing happened. We get mad if we pray for 4 minutes and God don't do what we want him to do. So for 4 months, he prayed and nothing happened. That's a disillusioning experience, isn't it? Because God says you pray and you call on him, he'll answer. Right? And we even sing the song, he's an on-time God. Yes, he is. Right? But we forget about the rest of the song. He may not come when you want him, but he's always on time. So for 4 months, Nehemiah prays and nothing has happened. That's disillusion. That will break your heart that you're praying for something and nothing happens. Perhaps you heard me say or a preacher say one Sunday, just pray to God, give the situation to God, and he'll work it out. So you went home, you prayed about it, read Matthew, the frustrating problem, you prayed about it, and you ended that prayer with the favorite American word, closing words. Lord, give me patience. And I want it now. Then Monday morning comes and nothing changed. What's worse, a month comes and nothing changes. Then 2 months and nothing changed. And then if you're like me, Lord, are you awake? Did you hear me when I prayed? Another month passes and still another. And that was Nehemiah's experience. Here he prayed to God, following all of the steps of faithful prayer, understanding that prayer is a vehicle to communicate with God, understanding that you got to have the right heart, the right motive, knowing you got to come to God with the right attitude, knowing you have to approach him the right way, knowing that you got to ask him things that are according to his word and his will and his way, and you're doing all of that, and you're following the steps of prayer, and nothing happens. Anybody been there? You've been praying, and that all of us who are prayer warriors come to learn, and that is that patience and waiting on God is of primary importance. Even when you pray and you know that what you're praying about is in line with God's will, you still got to learn how to be patient and wait on God. The songwriter says you can't hurry God, you just have to wait. And so in prayer, even though your prayer lines up with God's will, I'm trying to drive it home, you still have to learn to wait on God and be patient when you take your issues to God. So that's what Nehemiah was doing. He was just waiting. In the diary that he kept, nothing was entered probably in his diary. He kept that his prayer diary. I prayed to God about this, and nothing happened. So for 4 months, he probably had no entries. Nothing was happening. He just waited. No visible, no glimmer of hope, no visible sign. Nothing was changing. He kept on waiting. He kept on trusting, counting on God to move the heart of his superior. Nothing happened for 4 months. But then chapter 2 picks up. He's in this familiar situation. The king and the queen, they're finishing a meal. And he brings them in some wine. Now he says in chapter 2, he says, now I have not been sad in his presence before. Do you know how to tell when someone wants you to know that they've been praying? You know how to tell when folks want you to know they've been praying? Just look at their face. Yeah. When they've been praying long hours in prayer, spending some time, just look at them. And when they want to show you how spiritual they are, just look at their face. Their face they got a long countenance. You know how we get real spiritual. And so Nehemiah had been praying for 4 months. I mean, he was excited day one, Sister Harris. I mean, for 4 months, the same prayer, nothing has happened. It's going to wear thin, and all of a sudden, his countenance began to change. I don't care how spiritual you are. I don't care how spiritually pious you are. If you pray and asking God, after a while, it's going to show on your face when nothing happened according to your timeline. So Nehemiah comes before the king. He said, look, I didn't have a sad face in his presence. But on this day, after 4 months of praying, Nehemiah had a gloomy glad. I tried to spend about 3 hours praying. Anybody ever tried to spend 3 hours praying? I mean, just praying. Nothing else, no drinking water, no going to the restroom, no answering the phone. It's hard enough to pray for 3 minutes.
Come on now.
Even the longest prayer that our deacons have prayed during devotion is about 2.5 minutes. It seemed longer than that. But to pray 3 hours, I tried. I kept moving. I couldn't find the right position. And then afterward, I was totally exhausted and drained. But here, Nehemiah has prayed for 4 months, earnestly, every day, taking his concern to the Lord, and nothing happened. So after 4 months, goes to the king. He's serving the king wine. And he says, if it's ever going to happen, God, I need you to make it happen now. I imagine that this was a Blue Monday for Nehemiah when he's serving the king in verse 2. And look at what the king says. He says, why is your countenance sad? What's going on with you? And I can appreciate Nehemiah's honesty because many leaders no longer admit their human weaknesses, but not Nehemiah. He honestly said, when the king said to me, what's wrong with you? Nehemiah says, I got scared. No matter how great you may become, it's important that every now and then you let the cracks in your life show. rather than hiding it, Nehemiah admitted it. He said, I was scared. I was sore afraid. And he had good reason to be afraid. Because if you're a subject to the king, and you're noticeably sad and melancholy in the king's presence, that's grounds for being killed, because you're guilty of raining on the king's parade. But look at verse 3. God now ushers Nehemiah into the midst of answered prayer. It says, and said to the king, after I've been afraid, let the king live forever. Why should not my countenance be sad when the city, the place of my father's sepulchre, lie wasted, and the gates thereof are consumed with fire? Then the king said to me, what dost thou make request? He'd been praying for 4 months. Lord, change the heart of the king. Help the king adjust his attitude toward me. He waited. The king said, hey, what's wrong with you? Why are you looking sad? I gotta be honest, king, I'm afraid, but look, my home is in trouble. And the king says, what is it that you need me to do? Right then, Nehemiah was ushered into the midst of answered prayer. What's your request? God had touched the heart of the king, adjusted the king's thinking, made the king receptive to Nehemiah's wishes. Everything Nehemiah had asked God to do, God had done. And then in verse 5, Nehemiah says, King, if it please you, and I found favor in your sight, will you send me unto Judah, unto the city of my father's graves, that I can build it? Everything that he asked God to make a way for, God grants that way. And the king then gives permission. But look at this. You ask God for something. You wait on him. You pray about it, wait on him. Then God positions you to receive what you've been asking for. But then look at what Nehemiah does in verse 6. When the king said, what do you want? He said, this is what I want. Then Nehemiah has a plan. All this time you've been praying for God to do something, and you don't have a plan when God gets ready to answer it, then you just prayed in vain. Because Grandma said, the Lord helps those who help themselves. And so even though you're patiently waiting on God, and my prayer says I'm trusting in God to do, when God does his part, you got to be ready. You say, oh God, I got to get ready. No, it's time to go now. And so Nehemiah has a definite plan and a time. He tells the king, look, I'm going to go for this amount of time. I'm going to do this. I need this. Those verses all the way through 10. Here's what I'm going to need. Can you help me? I got to go through these places. Can you give me your approval? Can you give me a letter? Here's how long it's going to take. Here's what I'm going to do when I'm there. Here's what I need in order to do. God honors a plan. God honors order and organization. Can you imagine what had previously transpired in Nehemiah's mind in order for him to provide an immediate, on-the-spot response to the king? King said, what you need? He didn't have to think about it. Well, let me go figure it out. No, he was already ready. I need 4 months. I've been praying for 4 months. I need this amount of time. Here's my plan. Here's what I'm going to do. The scripture says the mind of a man plans his way, but the Lord orders his steps. So Nehemiah says, here's my plan. Verses 7 through 9, King says, okay, you can go. But wait a minute, before you leave, before I leave, here's a couple more things I need to talk about, King. Okay, what is it that you need? If it please the king, he said again, I need some letters. Can you give me some letters? Because I'm going to have to go, to some governors beyond your territory. And I'm going to need your approval to go through their territory. And I'm also going to need you to give them permission to give me the things that I need. I need some timber, because I can't build a house without timber. And then I'm going to need some help to carry this timber. So the king gives him letters, and then he sends some soldiers with him. He sends some helpers with him. Many leaders miss the blessings of God because their plans are short-sighted. But Nehemiah had a long-range plan. He knew what he needed to do. He sought God for what he was going to do. The king, he said, look, when I get to the places, the first thing you're going to ask me is, where am I going? And when I get to them, I have to tell them I'm going to Jerusalem. And they're going to say, well, why are you going to Jerusalem? And where's your permission to go to Jerusalem? And I'm going to have to give them letters. And when I give them those letters, then they'll let me go through. Nehemiah had thought it out, because a letter from the king would get you entrance into wherever you needed to go. And then when he got to Asaph, he made a requisition. And his requisition was for some lumber so he could get down. And so all throughout the time of waiting for God to answer, Nehemiah had made preparations. For 4 months, he made preparations. And then verse 9 says he starts this journey. And as he starts this journey with the king's letter, he comes upon these people who will have to help him along the way. Verse 10 shows us that when he gets there, and I'm going to cut across the field, he faces his first opposition. Verse 10 says, when Sanballat, the whole, and the enemy heard that I was coming that way and what I was trying to do, it grieved them exceedingly that there was come a man to seek the welfare of the children of Israel. Nehemiah faces first opposition. Here he says, God, I need help to go down there. God makes a way. And when you walk by faith, what Nehemiah will share, this is a good place to kind of hunk it off, is that when you walk by faith, you will invariably collide with some Sanballats and Tobias. If you've ever attempted any project requiring some volunteer labor, you have encountered people who never tire of quoting Murphy's Law. It won't work. We ain't never did it like that before. Their whole life is one big negative. They have a critical spirit that smothers them. Whenever a challenge comes their way, they respond, it can't be done. So when Sanballat and Tobiah heard about Nehemiah coming, their immediate response was, no way. You see, in addition to their negative attitudes, they had business investments with the citizens of Jerusalem. And Nehemiah's plan was sure to hurt their pocketbooks. And they began to make plans to oppose God's arrangements. When you walk by faith and you seek to lead, you will encounter the hostility of people who walk by sight. They are rebuked by the life of faith. They are especially rebuked because they don't have your vision. So Sanballat and Tobiah heard about Nehemiah's ambitious plan to rebuild the city wall, and they were disturbed. The issue with this is that you and I, as if you're going to be a leader, you can't tell your big dreams to little people. Especially little people with small minds. See, small minds talk about people. Average minds talk about things. But great minds talk about ideas. Experiencing criticism and opposition doesn't necessarily mean that you're outside of God's will. Rather, it reinforces the fact that you are in the very center of God's will. Let me give you some notes on opposition, because this is where we're going to go for the next couple of messages. Opposition will come. And I'm not surprised, and you shouldn't be surprised, that opposition comes. But you should be surprised sometime in where it comes from. Opposition always comes when you're making progress. Opposition always comes when you're making progress. I ain't giving two all rights and one amen. At least 2 times a year I do master cleanse, where I do a purging. It's really a juice fast, where I don't drink anything but this lemonade concoction all day long for 7 to 10 days. And I make up in my mind that I'm going to do the master cleanse, because I'm going to detox and I'm going to lose some weight. All right? I've already talked about my shirts getting tight. So 2 times a year I do the master cleanse. Right? I do all right the first couple of days. And I start sensing some progress. But then I smell some McDonald's French fries. Or the boys want me to cook something. And so now I got to smell what I ain't say taste, I got to smell what I'm cooking. I'm making good progress. Opposition always comes, listen, when you're making progress. Jealousy is a cause of opposition. And it can be jealousy from outside or inside. Opposition comes from people with different agendas. We're looking at Sanballat and Tobiah. See, because some folk have plans for you that you don't know about. And you ever want to know what folks' plans, that they have plans about you that they don't know about? You want to know how they have plans for you? Well, when they say something like this, I didn't think you would like that. That means in their mind, they already had some plans about you. Y'all with me? People will oppose you when you are a threat to the status quo. Talking to leaders. When you're a threat to their selfish intentions. When you're a threat to their secured position. Because some people don't want to see progress. They don't want to see growth. If you're a leader, make sure you're there for the welfare of the people, not for self-aggrandizement or acting or seeking to make yourself greater. This is a leadership series, right? So if you know that opposition is coming, then you need to be prepared for the opposition. And you need to know why people are opposing you. Let me give you 4 principles on preparation, and then we're going to move. Nehemiah was preparing. What he had to do was already a tough job. And if you're a leader in any capacity, leadership is not easy. The hardest part of leadership is fellowship. Get folk to follow your leadership. Right? You got a tough job if you're a leader. And since Nehemiah had a tough job, but he had his head on straight, he knew what he had to do. Even though the job was tough, he accounted for what he had to do. He made the preparations for what he had to do. And then here's the 4 things he did. Number 1, changing a heart is God's specialty. If you're a leader and you're wondering why folk can't follow you, why you can't get people to go and do what you need done to help your ministry, help you go forth to accomplish what you need to accomplish, you got to remember that changing a heart is God's specialty. Do not, I repeat, do not try to change people to fit your specifications. Don't try to manipulate people, play games, plan schemes or tricks, or deceive them. Instead, tell God, let God deal with them. And if they're stubborn, let God deal with them. If they're unfair and unbending, just plain unreal, take them to God. Then just relax and let God take care of them. Right? Then when change comes, guess who gets the glory? God. That's the first thing. Second thing, principles on preparation, is you got to pray and wait. And praying and waiting go hand in hand. You never really have prayed until you learn how to wait. And to wait with a certain release. And look, God, I put it in your hands. I'm going to wait for you. I'm going to abandon myself. I'm going to let you change the king's heart. I know this is a tough job. It cuts across the grain of our human nature, but I'm going to stand firm. I'm going to give up my homemade solutions, and I'm going to let you take charge. Right? Because praying and waiting go together. Number 3, faith is not a synonym for disorder or a substitute for careful planning. Just because you're waiting on God to move, and you have faith that God's going to move or he's going to do what he wants to do, that doesn't mean you don't plan. People of faith need to have orderly minds. Leaders like Nehemiah think things through. They think the problems through that they're going to face. And although their circumstances may allow them to go only half a step every now and then, you can be sure that they're ready to go that half step. Right? Because God will then help you to make the next 12 steps. Because faith breeds organization. All right? When you got faith, just go ahead and plan your program. Have faith. And let God work it out. But don't not have a plan. Because folk will jump on at the end. We call them bandwagon folk. They jump on at the end and say, look what we did. And you're like, where we been all this time? That's what you want to say on the natural. But you can't say that. You got to say, yes, we did with the help of the Lord. Number 4. Opposition is to be expected when God's will is carried out. When a person knows he's following and have God's will, it's unusual if you're following God's will not to have any opposition. But when you're doing God's will, you will face some opposition. All right? Throughout this series, I'm through for this morning. Because leadership is so important, I want to deal with it. And Nehemiah kind of had 4, I think I talked to you about the first week, had 4 prerequisite steps that he took if you're ever going to desire and discover what leadership is all about. First, you got to realize your own limitations. If you're going to be a leader, realize your own limitations. Because only God can change your heart. Number 2, turn to God. Pray and wait. Number 4, have an organized, feasible plan of action. So that while you're waiting for God to answer, you got a plan. And number 4, press on. Right? Despite vocal opposition, press on. Press on to execute the plan. Because when God opens the way and it's open, you got to do the rebuilding and the job that God sent you to do. A plan is primary for waiting for God to work. Right? God had a plan before the foundation of the world. Yeah. John 3:16 says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son." God just didn't do it just because he didn't have a plan, but he had a plan. In fact, Scripture says that Jesus was the Lamb slain before the foundation of the world. If God had a plan, then we ought to have a plan as leaders. But listen, even though God had a plan, Satan had a plot. But God's plan is always greater than Satan's plot. God had a plan, but Satan had a plot, right? Because in the midst of God's plan, Judas, was betraying Jesus. That was the plot of the devil. But God had a plan. And he said, for this cause, I sent Jesus into the world. Don't let opposition stop you if you're in leadership position. If you're doing the job, and the task assigned that will honor God's word, will submit to God's will, then let God do the work. But be prayerful.